Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy, and we have a really interesting, fascinating conversation for you today with Kevin Krim. Kevin is one of my tragedy buddies. He's also a solid business dude, so we're going to get into both aspects of his life shortly. But first, thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media. We'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about my pal, Kevin Krim. He is president and CEO at EDO, the TV Outcomes Company, a leading platform measuring predictive behaviors driven by Convergent TV advertising. It's a company he co-founded over 8 years ago with actor and filmmaker Edward Norton and Daniel Nadler. Prior to EDO, Kevin was the general manager and senior vice president of CNBC Digital, and previously held leadership positions at Bloomberg, Yahoo, and LookSmart, when he began his career with McKinsey Co. He is the co-founder and chairman of the nonprofit Lulu and Leo Fund and its flagship Choose Creativity initiative. Kevin, welcome into the back room.
Andy, great to be here.
So you are one of the few people who I affectionately refer to as my tragedy buddies. I've met a lot of people over the years who have experienced the kind of tragedy that I think my listeners know that I've been through. You know, the situations where you've literally been to hell and back, and therefore have a journey that is very different than most people. And just for a little context, back in October of 2012, you had 2 children who were murdered by their nanny. Awful, awful story, worst thing imaginable. So I'm curious, what was your coping mechanisms back then? What was your process? Did you go to a lot of therapy? Were family and friends instrumental? Were you surprised at how some people stood up and how some people didn't show up?
Yeah, it was the worst thing you can imagine. And it was actually, I think, worse than most people would imagine in their mind's eye. And yet, the getting through it, it was all of those things you mentioned, and more. And it was, I think it was really revealing about Marina, my wife, Marina, and my relationship. It was revealing about our relationship to our surviving daughter, Nessie, who's now, 14, almost 15. Who was only 3.5, going on 4 at the time, and who, Marina and Nessie walked in on the murder scene, and it was as horrific as you can imagine, or worse. But the resiliency, the ability to survive and then thrive in the face of that is, I think it's a deeply human thing. I don't think on many levels we were special in any way. I think we did a lot of the things right that we needed to do to get through it. But I always tell people, and I at this point, I think like you, have had to talk to a lot of folks who've lost people close to them in very traumatic ways. I feel like, we're probably go-to people for that, right? And I tell people it's worse than you would imagine, but you'll get through it better than you imagine too. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's innate in us that we know how to survive, and you get through it because you have to. You get through it because that's what humans do. It's Viktor Frankl's, great book, Man's Search for Meaning. I had just remarkably read it less than a year before the kids were killed, and just on the recommendation of a friend, and he talks a lot about how he survived the concentration camps, and he talks about, there's 3 reasons that people get through it. They survive because they want to achieve something, do something, and like write a book or finish some project that they have, or whatnot. The second reason is because people get through it for the love of somebody that they want to see again, and or they're supporting, and all of that. And then the third reason, and it's the highest level reason, it's because human dignity means that you suffer with dignity and grace, that you get through it because that's what it is to be human. And I thought a lot about that in those days. I mean, for me, like, it was the kids were killed on an evening on Thursday, October 25th. And I was literally like, my flight from California was landing like an hour after they were murdered. Um, and, and I met Marina and Nessie in the hospital, and saw Lulu and Leo, like, sort of, to say goodbye to them, cold on a table. And then we were whisked, away by the NYPD, who did for us, did a remarkable job. I'm, I'm, I'm aware that they're not always perfect in a lot of ways, but for us, they treated us incredibly well. And they took us to a hotel that had a very secure lobby because the press were all over, us and our family members. And it was really a horrible feeling to think, that, already this was a global sort of news story. That just added so much pain to the overall situation. And yet people protected us and took us in and really tried to, support us in a lot of ways. But at after all the dust was settled, there we are, Marina and Nessie and I, in a hotel room, you know, after our world had literally been just blown to pieces. And the kids were murdered in our apartment. You can't go back there. It's a crime scene. And you don't want to go back there. It's radioactive, emotionally. And so, then it kicks in that you want to take care of them. That's how I did it, at least, is I wanted to make sure that they got some food because they hadn't probably eaten in half a day. And then you start to realize, oh shit, like, we got to go to sleep and wake up the next morning. And, it's so interesting because there's that old adage, right? Like, the sun will rise, like the world will keep spinning, and it'll all feel better in the morning. And it didn't that first morning. It felt worse, right? Because you wake up and you're like, fuck, this is not a dream. This actually happened.
Nightmare.
It's a nightmare. Yeah. You thought like this was this, and that feeling, I'm sure you can relate to this, like that feeling of like, is this really, like, you'd stop and just say, like, is this really happening, or am I having some hallucination? And is this just some really bad, really vivid nightmare?
I mean, I'm a pretty rational, logical person. And those first few days, the phone would ring and I literally would think it's Adrian on the phone.
Right.
And then I'd have to stop myself and say, it's not Adrian, she's dead. But
right.
I mean, I couldn't believe that my mind even went there, but it was that way for a couple of weeks.
Yeah. And then, Nessie, who was sleeping between us in this hotel king size bed, she turns and says, Dada, I'm hungry, and that was like sort of that moment where sort of I realized, you know what, like, there will be time to go through all the sort of all of this, but I first and foremost have to make sure, like, I get Nessie some food. And yeah, it's easy as calling, room service, but like, even that act seemed like a sort of a big achievement when, you're literally in that fog. And, and then, yeah, it was, okay, let me write. And this is very much me. Like, I need to have a list of things to go do. I gotta accomplish things, or else I feel like, I'll sink is I think is the feeling. And that's, I think, good for me in a lot of ways. But, in this case, it was the only way I knew how to respond. And yeah, it was, I think for me, I knew enough to think like, we're going to need therapists for sure. And so, I had a phone blowing up with text messages, and I kind of quickly found one of my college roommates who was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School. And I said, like, hey, just, can you work your network to find like who are the best trauma psychiatrists you can find, and like get me their numbers. And, and remarkably, like, we found this fantastic person, Dr. Tony Charavastra, who's at NYU. He's specializes in childhood trauma and psychiatry, about how to treat kids who've come out of war zones and other traumas. And I was able to talk to him like in the first, I got to go back and actually do the timeline, but I think it was in the first 24 or 36 hours or so. And he said, listen, there's uniqueness to every situation, but here's some of the sort of things we've learned over time that you should do with Nessie to give her something solid to hold on to. And I like wrote those down, and I felt such a relief that somebody was just giving me a framework when the world feels like utterly upside down, shattered in a million pieces. To have some framework meant everything to me. And it was very different from Marina, and I'm always reluctant to like speak on her behalf, right? Because she's had a really powerful way of doing this herself, but she approached it very differently. And I think that's true of most people, is that you're going to have a very different style. You got to understand your own style of how to handle grief and trauma and your response to it. And she leaned into her way of it, which was more spiritual, I'd say, than me, I was more cerebral. She was more spiritual. But this, just to bring it home, I mean, what we did after a long time kind of realize, it took us a couple of years afterwards to figure this out. The commonality was creativity. Like, we were using our creativity to find our way through this, and to rebuild. And so that's what is the sort of heart of the nonprofit that we had founded. And we had originally founded it like a week or so after the kids were killed, because people just started giving to like a GoFundMe.
Right.
And I'm like, we don't need, like, we're not like independently wealthy, but we're like fortunate. I had a good job, and that the people I was working for at the time, NBC Universal and Comcast, they took great care of us. They said, just take as much time as you need. They just wrapped their arms around us. And I was very grateful for that. So we didn't need the money. And we knew that we wanted to honor Lulu and Leo's legacy, and yet we had no clue what to do.
Right.
And it took us, a while, but we realized that their legacy and the gift that they gave to us was, realizing that like our creativity was so core to our resilience and our ability to eventually rebuild, that we wanted to try to like share that with the rest of the world. And it's hard, by the way, to like put those ideas into something concrete, but that's what we've tried to do with the Lulu Leo Fund and our flagship initiative, which we call Choose Creativity.
You mentioned like you don't feel special. And that's an interesting conversation, because maybe it's not special, but I always felt that I was lucky. Lucky in the sense that I had tools. And one of those tools was strength in that incredibly dark moment. And you and I are very similar. We're business guys. It was a efficiency process that we approach life with. It's like make a list, do this, do that. Our kids were basically around the same age. Like Sophie was not quite 3 when Adrian died. And I remember going home from the police station that night. I knew in that second what the rest of my life was going to be about. I had to take care of that kid. So when you say Nessie was hungry, I think guys like you and I are lucky that we were able to see beyond ourselves. And maybe we're lucky because we had kids. And that forced us not to go into a rabbit hole and lock ourselves in a room with a bottle of Jack Daniels for 6 months.
100%. I mean, gratitude is, I think a lot of people talk about this, so this is not a unique insight, but I mean, I think gratitude is really important. And that sense of like, it could always have been worse, right? I mean, I could have lost Marina and Nessie too in that same crime. I mean, like, the nanny could have ambushed them as they were walking into the dark apartment, and instead she had put a knife into her own throat. But like, one little one little twist or turn in that, and like I would have been all alone, and that would be a very different
Right.
situation. Yeah. And you know, who knows? I mean, my ego would like to believe that I would have like been able to cope with that, but I don't know. I'm not sure of that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think gratitude, like, you know, it it is important to have, even if you're not going through traumatic loss, right? Because I do think like a lot of us are very fortunate to like to be able to make this podcast and listen to this podcast means we're pretty fortunate
Mm-hmm.
in the grand scheme of like the history of this planet and human civilization. Like we're very fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
And so starting from that point is a good grounding of it all. And, you know, like I had to hit the books in a big way for that's the other like part of me that is just like my way of coping with stuff is if I'm like if I feel unsettled or confused or just like not, you know, ready for something, I hit the books. And it was really an interesting process of discovery there. But like I was somebody, and I wish I could figure out where I found him because I owe this person, whoever got me to the writing of Thich Nhat Hanh, um, who, if you haven't read him, is my like just to me the ultimate. And they gave me No Death, No Fear that he had written,
Mm-hmm.
and that book like literally, you know, changed my life. And I think it's done that for a lot of folks, and so I always recommend it. Um, you know, he tells this like just very simple like thought exercise he talks about where if you're an astronaut and you go to the moon and you suddenly discover that like your return craft is irretrievably broken, like what's the one thing you would wish? Like you would just want to be back on Earth with 2 feet on the ground. You wouldn't wish that you had a bigger house or a nicer car or a better marriage or anything. You just would want to be back on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that thought exercise is really also very like literally grounding and figuratively grounding. You know, it's just let's like stay centered on, you know, how grateful we should just be to like be alive right now and capable of taking that next step.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, those things are just, I think, really, really useful
Mm-hmm.
ideas.
Back in the day when this happened, and in the weeks and months after, did you go through a period? Because I know I did, where you'd walk down the streets and you'd see families and their kids, and just say, "Why me? Why
Oh,
do I get to live this way and not that way?"
110%. And I mean, I think it's it was super helpful just to realize how common some of these things are, and you know, and um, it's not dissimilar to what a lot of people who've gone through traumatic experiences, how they feel alienated from the average other person
Mm-hmm.
or other people around them, right? Like you start to realize, wow, like I've gone through something that most of these people haven't yet. And the yet part is, I think, helpful too, where it's like most people will eventually,
Mm-hmm.
and that at least makes you feel a little less lonely and a little less alienated from the rest of, you know, society. In particular, yeah, there were these moments of feeling sorry for ourselves where we were pretty quick to jump on that.
Mm-hmm.
That was something where Marina and I were very aligned and very like in the same cycle of our responses, where when we started feeling sorry for ourselves, we would like call each other out on it and really respond well. But the other one was the angrier kind of version of that, where it was a resentful feeling, you know. And I'd say we lost some friends over that, where some people would just like we hadn't seen them since the kids died. And like, I don't know what was going on in their heads. Like it might have been their own uncomfortableness with it all, but like they'd be complaining about how like they didn't get the room they wanted on vacation at the fucking Four Seasons in Maui or whatever. And you're like, are we really, is that the conversation really? You know, and I'm
Well,
not
that's a
exaggerating.
problem. That's a
Right.
problem.
Yeah. And it was like a couple of those people, like in particular, this happened to Marina, where she's just like, I can't be around them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I just can't. And I didn't push back on that. I was like, yeah, I get it,
Mhm.
because that was
It is startling
tough.
when it
I remember,
happens.
like, yeah, I remember this one vivid memory. I mean, it was really tough to just like go out for a while, right? And there was all there's lots of awkward moments and bad moments, but we we were well past. It was probably a year or two after the kids were killed. Um, Probably a year, but before Felix, our fourth kid. So we had a son almost a year to the day. It was like a couple weeks before the first anniversary of the kids' deaths. We had another child who's named Felix, and he's lovely and just a joy. But it was probably a little before that where, there was this paranoia where, like, is the universe gonna like let us have another moment of happiness? Like, and Marina would have these like paranoia moments where he must be like, there must be something wrong with my pregnancy. Like it can't be going right,
Mm.
which is like, it's just so understandable and awful at the
Mhm.
same time. But anyway, I was on a subway, I think. Not I think. I was on a subway, um, going through Brooklyn for whatever reason, and like we were at the Barclays Center stop, and like there's this guy, I won't name him, but he's a TV, commentator in the finance world. And he gets on looking tanned and happy and fucking healthy as can be. And he's with his like two adult sons or like teenage sons.
Mm.
And they've clearly just come from some concert or some sporting event at Barclays. And they're just happy as, pigs in shit. And I'm like, fuck you, is what I'm
Fuck
thinking
you
in
and
my
your
head.
happiness.
Yeah. You like, what the fuck? Like, you've made a bunch of money in banking and now you're on TV all the time. And, like, I just was so resentful in that moment. And I had to go talk about that with my therapist for a
Mhm.
while. I remember,
Well, it's very
um,
natural because I
yeah,
remember walking down the streets and seeing happy people and being angry, like, why are they happy when I'm going through this? Like, how could the world be moving on and my
yeah,
world is just upside down? It's just natural to get resentful and angry.
yeah. It makes me think of, and I should know the names involved, but there's a really good poem. Again, I don't remember who wrote it or what it's called, but it talks about how the Dutch masters, the painters, always got it right. That it like, you know, Icarus is falling into the sea, and there's a shepherd, and just tending his flock, and another person's carrying their milk to the market, and life goes on,
Hmm.
and like the world doesn't care about the big or little tragedies that
Hmm.
like are constantly happening around us.
So life does
And
go
yeah,
on. So I want to ask you about closure.
yeah,
Do you
oof,
believe in closure? Do you have closure? Do you think that's a ridiculous concept? Can you ever get closure?
yeah, yeah. I think it's largely a ridiculous concept. Um, but couple things. I always talk about with people who've gone through something like this, and they're like, it's usually I'm talking to them in like the days or weeks after their trauma and their traumatic loss, and I say like, I give Dr. Tony credit for this. He gave me the analogy really early on in our therapy sessions. He said, your world's like this snow globe, and right now your grief, your loss is like a rock that is almost the same size as the glass enclosing your snow globe. Like there's almost no room for anything else. Like you're feeling like you can hardly move because your grief is that big. The only way around it is not to shrink the grief and the loss. It's to live and grow. And in growing and living, you're growing your snow globe.
Hmm.
And that grief over time, that loss doesn't dominate like it used to.
Hmm.
There's room for other stuff in your world other than that giant rock of grief. And eventually, I think, that rock doesn't go away ever, but it does become like a much smaller piece of the whole world that you're inhabiting. And, I wake up every morning and I'm going to think about Lulu and Leo guaranteed in like, the first hours of
Right.
that day.
How could you not?
Yeah. But, that horrible sense of like aching, just absence and void, or that sense of anger, like they're there still, but they're not as dominant. They're not as powerful. And it shifts. Like, you get worried about forgetting them. You get worried about like the details, the sound of their voice or the feel of their hugs and all those kind of things that are like, am I starting to lose the grip on what those were really like? That's how it evolves for me. But yeah, I mean, so I think on that level, there's no closure. It's just growth. But you and I both had the criminal justice system to deal with, right? Where that did matter to me. And I was very aware of how it was not in my control, right? It wasn't in your control either what happened. But I think you and I both probably felt like we couldn't just sit there and be passive, right? That's just not who we are. And that was a very tricky thing to navigate, because it's not spiritual. It's not, it's just this very real, very awful thing. And it took ages for us to get through it. I mean, it was, I think it was almost 6 years until it got fully like through the trial. It was a little just shy of 6 years for us after after the murders to get to a trial and that resolution. I mean, that's how long it was just hanging there over us. And it would be like 6 months at a time where there'd be absolutely nothing happening, right? But you'd still know that this specter was looming. And that was very rough. In the end, the woman who murdered our children, she was convicted of life in prison without a chance of parole, which to me was the ideal outcome, of a horrible situation. I mean, I had always said, like, I don't know what I'll do if that woman's given a chance at freedom again, right? I mean, that would be hard for me to be able to like accept, like to be able to, like I always said to the prosecutors, like I said, like my goal in this is to be able to tell Nessie that woman's never going to be able to get out of jail. I don't ever want to have like a parole hearing. I don't want to have like the chance that she's out and then I have to explain that to Nessie. I don't care what age Nessie is. It's like, I'm not having that conversation with him. And, I had really good friends who were giving us really good advice through that whole thing. And several of them were like former prosecutors in New York City who are like, we can't predict what's going to happen. Like, you don't know. And that was, I'm very clear in my own head that like, if that process had gone another way, I would be feeling very differently than I feel right now.
Yeah, well, that's how it went for us. I mean,
I know.
our killer he's going to be out in 9 years or something like that. And I remember when Sophie was younger, she would literally say to me, when he gets out of prison, is he going to come kill us?
Yep.
And like, you're standing on a street corner trying to explain the judicial system to a 7-year-old. You've said to me that you recently reconciled the merging of your personal journey with your business and professional one. It took you a decade or more to get to that point. What was that process?
Yeah, I mean, I would say Marina and I were both pretty private people, just as a default setting, so to speak, introverts, I'd say. I can talk, but people don't realize that I'm very introverted. Like I just get drained by those big social moments, and need my quiet alone time. And I think Marina's very similar. And so the shock of being splashed across the cover of the New York Post and on TV news and all that was so painful for us that we really, really, really wanted to like be very, very private. At the same time, we realized, and this was, I don't really understand where this came from either, but we realized that the only way to combat that terrible news cycle was to use social media to kind of control our narrative. I know that sounds crazy, but I mean, that was within months, we realized that like, if we just didn't talk to the press ever, but we wrote a post here and there on carefully worded post on Facebook or whatever, then that was all the press could go off of. Like that was all they would be able to use of us. And so we followed that strategy. But for me, like I had my whole like self-image was like blown up over losing two kids. Like what am I as a person if I can't protect my kids? And I didn't, right? And so like that need for like a safe place to like rebuild, we found that in our home life by moving from the Upper West Side down to Tribeca after, questioning whether we'd ever be back in New York ever, but we realized we should come back to New York and like own it again, which was by the way, a very good decision. Though it was not an obvious one at first. And for me, like the other safe place was going to be work. Like I could go to the office and like everyone had been very good and supportive to us, but like I could then kind of achieve something that wasn't, about the family that had been blown up and we were going to try to rebuild. And so I really was like, I just had it in my head, and I don't think it was the right decision, but it took me, like you said, almost 10 years to figure this out. I just wanted those things to be separate as much as I could. And the tension that I felt early on was our nonprofit, was the charitable impact we wanted to have through Choose Creativity and the Lulu Leo Fund. And so, I'm working for CNBC at the time, and Jim Cramer, the famous guy at CNBC, he's like, well, I'll help you guys raise money, and I'm like, how do I say no to that? And so, and it was a lovely thing that he was willing to do for us, and there were others like that, and so I was kind of feeling like I was on this balance beam for a long time, trying to keep these worlds separate. And our nonprofit was this place where they were sometimes touching, and then they'd come apart. And then I left CNBC a couple years later to start a company that I'm still at now, 8.5 years in. And it was that moment where I said, you know what, I'm gonna make sure I can do this on my own. Like no one's feeling sorry for me. No one's doing this because they want to help me out. Like I'm going to achieve something, which again, I think was the wrong impulse, but it was what was going through my head at the time. And I just realized it was kind of exhausting over time to try to have two hats on all the time, or two faces to the world. And it was interesting. I just got inspired by seeing some people writing more on LinkedIn about their personal lives, and some of that has gone the wrong way.
TMI.
But I think TMI very much. But done in the right way, I realized, wow, I can be a more whole person to my colleagues who matter a lot to me. I can be a more whole person for my nonprofit, where I'm the chairman and I'm the chief fundraiser. Like a lot of these people that I know on, through my professional life, I think would be happy to give if I were, showing that side of what I do all the time, instead of trying to keep them separate. And I realized too that like the writing and the sharing is good for me. Like it's cathartic, and why would I like only put that on like, on Facebook and not on LinkedIn, and so, yeah, I kind of got to this point. It was just 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago where it was the 11th anniversary of the kids' deaths. And we honored it like we always do by going up to Storm King Art Center. And I always try to write something to our friends and family, like reflecting on that moment. And, I was like, I like what I wrote. I'm gonna put this on LinkedIn too. On, no edits, just exactly what I post to friends on LinkedIn. I mean, on Facebook, I'm gonna put it on LinkedIn too. And the response was fantastic. Like, everyone was so supportive and not only supportive, but like appreciative that I was sharing this anecdote of, in the or the months after we lost the kids, like how did we achieve this like one thing of just trying to like go from LA where we were staying with family to go back to New York. And I told a little story about crossing over into the Mississippi River into Memphis and thinking to myself the lyrics to Paul Simon's Graceland. And then this moment of grace that I had while I was walking our dog around this hotel we stayed in. And this guy came up to me like asking for money and he saw me like crying, you know, and he hugged me and like said, it's going to be all right. Like whatever it is, it's going to be all right. And I was like, I still remember that vividly to this day. And so I shared that little story and like, that it helps for people who are, people, right? It doesn't matter how you know them. People are people. And like, we should be our whole, I regret that I wasn't my whole self to like
Well, it's a
all these
process.
folks I was interacting with.
It
Yeah.
took you time, but I think what you just said is really the key, and that's what I was going to comment on, is that it's understandable to try to escape it because it's horrible. I mean, who wants to think about that shit and talk about it? But then you get to a point where you realize like you're not the old Kevin anymore, right? I'm not the old Andy. Like my life
Yep.
took it's like the Year of Magical Thinking, right? Didion's book. I read that right after Adrian died. It's like
Love that book. Yeah.
life changed in an instant. And and I think, and it sounds like you have as well, that in order to really move forward healthily, you have to change with it. It's like, okay, this is now a truth of mine. This is my life. What do I do with it to put some good out into the world? So on that note, tell us about Lulu and Leo Fund and Choose Creativity, what it's all about and what the mission is there.
Yeah. So, it was very organic. Choose Creativity came directly from Marina and I trying to answer the question that people were asking us. And they asked it in the nicest way. I mean, they meant it like literally, how are you guys doing this? Like, how are you getting through it? Because you seem to be doing all right. Like, what is the secret to that? And, we didn't have an answer for a while. And Marina, she was a kindergarten teacher when we first met and was teaching up until we started having kids. And she got her master's in education with sort of a minor in arts. And so for us, we started trying to explain it to people and trying to answer the question just to ourselves. And we were clear that it was our creativity, but then the question was, how do you really share that? Like, we don't mean creativity in a sense of like we're good artists. What we meant is like it's a mindset. It's an approach to life. It's an approach to anything. And then Marina, like, she just wanted to turn it into a curriculum. That's like how she could relate to it. And we really talked about what are those things that make up creativity? Like, what is it? It's being authentic. Part of it's being resourceful. Part of it's being intuitive. Part of it's being inventive, right? And we came up with these 10 principles of creativity that really to us answer that question of like, how did we use creativity to get through what we were getting through and then eventually thrive again? And then I hit the books and I looked at like, what is the underpinnings of this in psychology? And I came upon this idea of self-efficacy. There was a phrase or a word coined by this professor at Stanford, Albert Bandura, who's I think pretty famous in this field. And he basically said, there is this thing that is innate in human psychology that is the ability to affect change on the world around oneself. And then he tried to like develop tests that would measure it and then see like for people who score higher on self-efficacy, like were they actually having different outcomes in life? And he found that people who have high self-efficacy, they do better in school, they have healthier relationships, they tend to do better financially, and most importantly, they're able to withstand and thrive through change and even trauma. And that was like click, for me, like getting to that research really kind of locked it all together and gave us a real focus for our nonprofit. And what we do now is we partner with schools or whole school districts. And individual teachers can do this too, but we like to focus on the whole school because what we're offering is a overlay curriculum that is about the wellness of the teachers and the students in the school, to about the overall health of the whole community around the school by building these 10 pillars, these like scaffolding pillars that support creativity. And the lesson plans are integrated into the rest of the curriculum. So, it's not like there's this hour once a week where you do creativity. Instead, we train the teachers. We do these professional development sessions with the staff at the schools. And what we're showing them is how you can build these 10 principles of creativity into your whole day. So when you're doing a math lesson, talk to the kids about how they can be unconventional in solving this math problem. How can they be resourceful in analyzing this nonfiction literature that they're going through? How can they apply this to their social studies, right? So we do that, and we ask the schools to pay whatever they can out of their professional development budgets, and then we cover the rest through our donors' support. And we have a very thin, small staff. It's only 2.5 full-time people, but we've achieved a ton. We've trained about 1,600 teachers, and 22,000 kids have been served through it. The big thing that we broke through with the New York City Department of Education, as you can imagine, has a few processes you have to go through to
few layers of bureaucracy.
A few layers. Yeah, I didn't want to use that label, but there's a few layers. And we were able to build a relationship with there's a whole office of attendance in the DOE here in New York City. And it turns out there's a massive crisis of chronic absenteeism in a number of schools. New York City is divided up into all these districts, and District 4 in East Harlem is the pilot of our rollout with the Office of Attendance, where we're training a bunch of the schools that are suffering from chronic absenteeism. And the numbers are startling. In District 4, 45% of students were chronically absent in the past couple of years. Our hypothesis, and we're collecting data on it as we do this pilot, is that by showing how creativity can help the teachers and the students to feel more effective in their entire day and their entire lives, how to be more resilient and to be more empowered learners and teachers, we think that's going to improve attendance. And so we're rolling that out to other districts within New York City. And we also have had just very organic adoption around the country and even the world. We have a Department of Defense elementary school in Japan that serves our service members' children. A teacher there adopted it and has been using it for years now.
So they find you, they just find you.
They find us on the internet. Yeah, through word of mouth. There's a school on the Navajo Nation's lands in New Mexico that is using us. There's schools in New Zealand, in Wales, and all over this country that are using us. So it's been just a beautiful thing. Marina works her ass off on it every day. I spend a lot of time on the strategy and the fundraising, and it's incredibly gratifying to see it when a teacher tells us it's the best training she's ever had, or a parent says, my kid has an entire new vocabulary about why they can solve problems. Like, that's the feedback that you live for.
It's so bittersweet because you see the impact of what you've done and the reach that you have and the level of people and children that you're helping, but then it's impossible not to think and go, it's only because of one reason. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's Lulu and Leo's incredible legacy that, they did this. The inspiration's entirely from them. Marina and I would not have done it without them. And there's so many people who've been inspired by what they did in their very short lives, and the legacy they've had since is huge. And I think that's all we can really do, right?
It's a lot. You've done a lot.
It's like, Yeah, and you don't have to do what we did. I don't mean that, but I mean what each of us who've lost someone can do is really just be inspired by their memory, by like what they represented in life.
Mm-hmm.
Like we can be inspired by that. We're gonna each manifest that very differently, I think, right? But like that is I think that's the only way to kind of remember them, through your grief and turn that into something that's worth living for.
Mm-hmm. And if people want to support, what's the URLs for?
It's choosecreativity.org,
Mm.
and there's a great website there, and you can give in a bunch of different ways. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, and yeah, check it out. I'd say if you're listening to this and you think this could be applicable to your school or to your district, by all means, reach out to us. That's our fundamental thing is we need to convince the people who run these schools and districts that this is a good program for them to adopt.
Well, it is a beautiful thing, and it is something that does contribute to a legacy that is very important. Let's shift to your professional career. You are the president and CEO of EDO. Tell us, give us the elevator pitch on EDO.
Yeah, we founded it 8.5 years ago. Edward Norton, the filmmaker, entrepreneur, and philanthropist. He's our co-founder and executive chairman of our company. He and I and our other co-founder, Daniel Nadler, who's a data scientist, we came together just over this shared frustration in how media and entertainment were being held back by old ways of thinking about the business models. Edward saw from his work on films that, the inefficiencies of marketing and distribution of films had a direct impact, not only on the compensation of the creators, the filmmakers and the actors and everybody else involved, but it also just changed what was being made, right? If you had to spend $100 million to get this movie out, you don't make small pieces of art anymore, right? You only make things with pre-existing IP, and you get to a reductive place on creativity. And so that was the big motivation. For me, I had spent the first half of my career as an advertising product manager, building some of the earliest search advertising and social advertising products at places that are like way back names like LookSmart and LiveJournal, and then at Yahoo. And then I had moved 14.5 years ago, almost 15 now. Marina and I had moved to New York to take a job at Bloomberg to build out their digital media business as that company was getting really serious about a consumer media part of its work. And then I did the same kind of thing at CNBC, and I was struck by how crazy it was that TV advertising, which powers so much of the entertainment that we consume, was based on a 1950s idea of just counting how many people are watching, and that's it. And so that has a huge influence over what gets made. And it has a huge influence over stuff that you and I care about, like cable news. And, somebody starts to realize that if you hack the system, you can create Fox News into a very profitable business. And yet, what is it doing for our, our civic, experiment? Like it's quite concerning. And so, EDO, it tries to change how we think about marketing on television and beyond television now that it's a streaming world where these definitions are collapsing. What we do is we think about, basically the way marketers on digital advertising have done for many years. You think about not who's seeing it as much as you want to care about what happens after somebody sees an ad. What do they do? Do they search for your brand or product? Do they go to your website or your app? Do they eventually buy something? And that kind of measurement, again, has been done forever in digital advertising, and EDO had to bring it for the first time to TV. And so he had to build a huge, crazy system of automatically seeing all the ads across TV with robots. And then you look at big patterns of data, like who's searching for what on Google, and you find these changes in those patterns that are attributable to the advertising that they saw. And that's what we do. And now we're the way people at Netflix ads measures the impact of the advertising they're selling. It's only Nielsen and EDO that work with Netflix ads. Amazon Thursday Night Football.
Mm-hmm.
We measure everything on Hulu, on Disney Plus as they're rolling out advertising. That's all measured by Yahoo. And we do all the traditional um, television as well.
Broadcast stuff.
All the broadcast stuff, including, interestingly, we work for MSNBC and Fox News and CNN. All of those folks are clients, and it's that's a strange.
I'm sure the
strange evolution.
Stats are all the same, from MSNBC to Fox, right?
I mean,
behavior patterns.
They are very different. There's very different content, but of a genre, and it delivers for each delivers for their advertising clients in their own unique way.
So, what trends do you see? What in terms of advertising on linear TV versus the streamers?
I think there a lot of it is in the granular sort of details, and it varies very much down to the creative. Each ad very much drives its own impact, and creativity is still at the core of it. But I'll say there are a couple of interesting patterns. Great programming, just great TV, whether we're talking about a drama like This Is Us, when that was on air, that was it was some of the most engaging programming for the ads. So what we've learned over time is that when people love what they're watching, they're also paying more attention and are more engaged with the ad breaks too. So great programming, whether it's drama or news or sports, will do great things for the ads that are in those programs.
And are the ads targeted more specifically to a specific show like that is successful and popular versus more generic type of advertising?
Yeah, the best creatives will be very sensitive to the context that they're appearing in. So the best creative ads are going to have some tonal or other kind of contextual relevance to the programming they appear in. But ultimately, everyone's trying to target a person. At the end of the day, they're thinking about, who's my idealized customer? What am I pitching to them? What is the offer there, right? Like, what is that emotional and logical sort of appeal I'm making, right? And you and I both come from that world, right? So we know what we're all trying to do, and then you're trying to imagine, or you're trying to use the data to see, where are they? Where are those people, and what are they engaging the most in? And that is working. I'll tell you, like, the reason traditional television and streaming is paying more for live events is because that is the stuff that attracts the most people and engages them the best with the advertising. It is a very logical relationship where live sports score the best in terms of the value for the advertisers. That's why it also costs the most for the advertisers. It's why these broadcasters pay so much to these leagues.
And does it vary between the sports? Like, I would imagine football is probably right up there, but like
Americans love the NFL and love college football. The NBA has done incredibly well and is continuing to grow in our data. NFL is definitely the king of the hill. There are women's sports are doing better and better as women's sports are given the equal footing in terms of their time slots on television, that they're on the biggest networks with the most sort of availability. Women's sports, especially the WNBA, women's soccer, like the Women's World Cup this past summer, those kind of sports, women's NCAA basketball tournament, those are being given real equality in terms of the quality of their broadcasts, and the advertising performance is starting to match that of the male equivalent sports. And that's really exciting because, again, there's this relationship where the value of the advertising will help more of that programming be seen by people, because that relationship is very direct. It's a very rational relationship of what we can prove is effective for advertisers is going to increase what gets funded for not just sports, but for creative entertainment, for news. And so I think that is the really positive trends that we're seeing, is that good quality programming can be paid for through advertising. And cable or streaming. There's also the subscription element to it. That is important. That dual revenue stream for the entertainment industry is alive and thriving. There was a thought back in sort of this early era of streaming that it could be subscription only. Netflix was going to destroy the world of advertising, and it was obviously very exciting to see Netflix realize that, you know what, we can serve more people and make them happier, and we as a business can make more money if we offer cheaper subscription tiers that include advertising, and then we can raise the prices on the top tiers of our plans that don't have advertising, and everybody wins because some people are more price sensitive, some people are less, right? And you can pay for great programming, great content by having advertising and subscription. And so I think it's actually a really healthy place that the entertainment and media industries are getting to, much more balanced than we were in a certain sort of gold rush type, era that we were just coming out of, where it was like we were probably overfunding content on the margin, and we were thinking that it was going to be paid for in a less resilient business model only through subscription, and that's not going to be the sustainable path. Like we need to find that equilibrium of dual revenue stream and a healthy amount of great content being created and funded, and I think we're getting close to that.
Well, the industry is in such a state of flux. I mean, broadcast TV is what it is. It's been on a steady decline over the years, just in terms of like appeal and content. And then you have the cable and streamers, and you look at Netflix, you look at HBO, you look at the companies that were traditionally the leaders that have been going through, shakeouts and mergers over the last few years. Netflix is obviously a category killer, HBO as well. Where do you see like the immediate future, and then just a little bit longer term? Where are things headed with how people watch and view and experience content?
Yeah, I mean, we've just kind of seen a couple watershed moments. There was two really big moments for the engine of television economics, which is live sports on TV. You saw Amazon get the rights for Thursday Night Football and pay a lot for that. That started last season, so a year ago, and they're doing well with it, which is not a sure bet. And then you saw Google and YouTube acquire the rights for the Sunday ticket, where if you're watching it, you can watch any NFL game no matter where you live and all that. And again, that's expensive. Those two things, moving from traditional satellite and cable to pure streamers and to tech companies, really, that are not media companies at heart, that's a watershed moment. Then the carriage disputes, most notably the Disney charter dispute. It was not a coincidence that fight came to a head right as football season was starting.
Oh, right.
Sure. And everybody who cares about football, which is a lot of Americans, they canceled their charter subscriptions and switched to YouTube TV or Fubo or one of these what are called virtual, TV providers.
Didn't it end like the day of the first Monday night game?
Yeah, I mean, it college football had started, and NFL was about to start, and that's when they settled it. But from a consumer perspective and an overall industry perspective, the damage was done, and the sort of like finger that was in the dike was out, and like the water is rushing through. Like it is fundamentally now a moment where everyone realizes that old cable business model has got to change in a very dramatic way. A lot of us have been thinking about this for over a decade, but it's always hard to know when that tipping point happens, and it's now. It's like we literally just lived through it in September. And then the actor strike and the writer strike, and thankfully they're both now resolved. But those were all about the changes in the underlying economics of the business, and everybody fighting for this, newly shaped pie. We're not sure if it's bigger or smaller, but it's certainly different shaped. Everybody wanted their bigger slice of it, and that is that is a key moment for for the overall industry. And so where's it going? I think you're going to see, we have already seen the sort of end of that gold rush era of just create more, more TV and more movies, and we'll figure it out later. Like, that's over. People are rationalizing like how much new programming do they really need. And then next is, and we're already going through this as we speak, the consolidation of the distribution points, right? Like, how you consume it got very fragmented, and it's now going to come back together. Warner Brothers and Discovery merging, collapsing all these different apps into sort of a mega app under this idea of Max. Whether we like that name or not, that's, that idea is a consolidation idea. Is Paramount going to be a standalone company 12 months or 24 months from now? Those kind of questions are going to keep happening. I think Google's in a very good place where YouTube is the 800-pound gorilla and is only going to grow from here. And I think we all got to like start to wake up to that idea that the old idea of TV is being redefined as in a much more broad way. And of course, like, TikTok, I don't think TikTok in its current format is very fun to consume on very large screens. Maybe it never will. It doesn't need to be, but I think what's powerful about a thing like YouTube is it looks freaking great on your big screen too. And like, there's generations now, like probably 2 generations of media consumers who like think of YouTube as like a starting point.
Sure. Well, a lot of people have given up cable and gone to YouTube.
Yeah. And you can go to YouTube TV, which is still like, it's cable just with better customer service.
Right.
But,
Cheaper.
but yeah, and a little cheaper for sure. But then there's like youtube.com, which is this just giant bubbling, pot of, sort of all types of content from professional. Like, you can watch most of Saturday Night Live on youtube.com, right? But you can also, it's not the same experience. It's chunked up, but you can still watch it. Or you can get Mr. Beast, or you can get, a great cooking, channel, or you can get like anything you want on how to fix anything, and all the other stuff, right? It's an incredible redefinition of what TV is. And, I think it's good for creativity. It could be a good business. It just depends on how you approach it.
Well, one thing we know is that it is moving fast, and it's going to keep moving fast and keep changing. It's just out of my wheelhouse. I'm still paying for cable, and I'm old school, but this has been a really fascinating conversation on obviously many levels. I really appreciate you sharing your complicated, challenging, yet inspiring life journey with us personally and professionally. Take care.
Thanks, Andy.
Bye. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.